Hello, my name is Virgil Dismeyer. Today we will discuss a topic that is ignored or misunderstood in most companies. We call this disaster recovery planning, but it is also called contingency planning or emergency planning. At the conclusion of this presentation, we hope that you will have an understanding of the role a disaster recovery plan can have for your company. As I stated previously, my name is Virgil Dismeyer. I am one of the few individuals who have developed a disaster plan and then had to use it for disaster recovery from a major fire. The ideas, forms, and logic of this presentation is an adaptation of the plan used by Northwest National Bank on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1982. I have tried to downsize the scope and simplify the concept for a small business. So keep in mind, you may have to modify some of the approaches to scale these ideas back to your environment and size. I have used a fillable form template, which should help you in this adaptation. Any such plan is a methodical self-examination of your risk, business needs, resources, and recovery options. These are the things we hope to accomplish. Terminology is tricky because we have two distinct topics in this webinar. Disaster planning is part one, and disaster recovery is part two. This is a project that must be approached with management commitment and dedication of the staff to do the analysis. It is a pay me now or pay me later scenario because disasters are inevitable. These are the reasons that a plan is necessary. They are almost self-evident and probably are a goal of every business. The biggest reason to have a disaster recovery plan is to survive. This slide shows more reasons, and it was the reason behind the original plan for Northwest Bank, now known as Wells Fargo in Minneapolis. It happened on Thanksgiving Day. It destroyed 17 floors of a downtown office building. The estimated loss was $140 million. It affected 1,500 employees, and those employees had to be displaced to 10 new sites. And it took six years to restore the operations in a new building. So the plan was obvious savior for Northwest Bank. Here are some more reasons to plan. And you might ask, why do a plan at all? Many companies have only a data processing backup plan. Others have pieces of a corporate-wide plan, but they are not integrated. This slide cites some of the key reasons a company should have such a plan. In some industries, officers and directors can be held liable for inaction. Sadly, 40% of businesses hit with a hurricane, flood, fire, or other disasters will fail. Your customers are the main reason you exist. They expect you to be there when the need arises. Some companies rely on insurance, but that excludes the loss of your image or customer impact. The financial services industry, where I had most of my experience, have government regulations requiring disaster recovery plans. These regulations are part of the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the Comptroller of Currency audits. These are some of the planning principles that you should keep in mind. This effort requires management support and involvement. In a small company, this is probably you, the owner, and the viewer of this webinar. Always think, what if this happened? Then assess your response. One principle is to integrate the pieces that may already exist, like an evacuation plan, a data processing backup facility, vital record storage, and other details. But look at that third bullet. Always think, what if? Many companies do not undertake disaster planning for fear of the cost or not understanding what cost may be involved. But these costs need not be a financial burden. It is more a matter of dedicating leadership time to get it done. This is why we chose to use a questionnaire, so the time required is minimized. These are my thoughts on the cost illustrated on the slide. One cost may be to negotiate and equip an alternative operating site. But keep in mind, this could be some warehouse space you already use, or a key vendor who may have facilities that could be adapted to temporary use by you in a disaster. You may find some system deficiencies as you think through a disaster. But to correct these deficiencies, are they really the cost of a disaster plan? If you find a void in your system, like a lack of data backup provisions or incompatibility in the IT support, they should be fixed even without a disaster plan. The biggest cost may be associated with creating an IT backup facility or other provisions like that. But they are not significant if you think through the alternatives. What are the basic needs that you will have if you have a disaster and have to recover? Well, just look around your office. This is what will be gone or inaccessible. This is what you will have to replace to recover your normal operations. Use this mental view as you complete the form for your disaster recovery plan. But it's obvious. You need staff. You need space to house the staff. The staff needs equipment, supplies, forms. They need records, and they need a plan to replace and integrate it in a crisis mode. The process of disaster planning. As I mentioned, we have developed a simple, fillable template form for the small company. We urge you now to download, print out, and follow the template as we go through this webinar. You can always go back and restart this presentation when you have that template in front of you. But the bullet points are the sections of that form that we will cover. So with this educational background behind us, we will address the disaster recovery planning process. We will rely on that form that I've cited above. Our discussion will follow the sections of that form. Hence, have it in front of you. The sections of the form are our agenda for today. Now let's look at the first section of the form. It deals with basic company information. It provides for two locations. The primary one is your current location. However, a disaster may make that site unusable, so an alternate site should be weighed. You may decide to rent whatever space is available at the time of your crisis. In that case, you might want to enter the name of a business real estate rental company and put their space specs in this part. It may be possible to operate from your employees' homes for a short period of time. Now would be a good time to look at your space contract if you lease. What does a lease provide in case of a fire, sprinkler flood, or other event that makes the space unusable to you? Does the lease cover your extra expenses? If so, is there a provision for you during the time the space is unusable? Then maybe you should discuss this with your landlord now. There is one need that you must consider in this section. Your company must have a site identified as your control center. In a small company, this is probably your alternative site. This is where your crisis management team would assemble to manage the recovery. In every disaster that I have been involved, a site is needed for daily assessments and briefings to take place. This is also a site where your vendors and at-home employees can turn for direction. Equip it or know that certain fixtures are available, such as computers and printers, a landline and cell phones for external communication, telephone list, a copy machine so that you can reproduce status reports, instructions such as your disaster recovery plan, a whiteboard or flip chart so that you can discuss the progress, a TV and a radio to follow the media coverage, and so forth. Your provision for temporary space is more than just temporary operating space. It will become your control center, as I mentioned, to coordinate the recovery. The previous slide discussed what and why it is needed. These points cover some of the considerations for selecting the temporary location. The link later on under other resources of this webinar contains a schematic of a more formal control center if you need more information. The next section of the template is for listing your emergency contacts. This is your immediate responder list, and it's more than public services. It includes insurance, landlord or rental agent, and other contracted security. Depending upon the size of your company, all employees may serve some role on the crisis management team. Larger companies will operate on the premise that all employees stay home until contacted for specific duties. In all cases, you should use call trees so crisis messages can be spread quickly to everyone. Be precise on the message so that there is no misconnect between intent and what is heard by the employee. The next step in the process is to weigh the risk and assess the odds of a disaster happening to you. This and the next slide set the stage for you to identify your risk. Study the slides carefully. The slides show some of the common disastrous events, but the plans I am familiar with also were used for officer or key customer hostage situations, an isolated branch outage, and so forth. Target Corporation's experience with cyber attack is a current reminder of the risk in some businesses. Just-in-time inventory control systems can put your company at risk if your vendor is not also prepared. to keep your needs filled, or if they do not have a backup vendor. What if these risks come to fruition? When assessing risk, remember, not all disasters will affect your constituents equally. This slide is just a reminder of what might be at risk. In the next slide, we will combine the prior slide and this one for your company. Just keep asking, what if, and follow our premise to plan for the worst, but hope for the best. This section will help you to set forth your predominant risk. The preceding slides listed some that may apply. Keep in mind that your risks are based upon your geographic location, type of industry, urban infrastructure, crisis event history, and so forth. Fire is probably a generic risk to all businesses. Then if you look at how your risk impact your resources, it will become apparent that all risks are not equal. This type of thinking will help on the next section of the template, where you prioritize your operations for recovery. The priority list. This section lists the key operations and slots them into outages that can be accepted. This becomes the to-do list for the crisis management team in the control center when a disaster strikes. In order to give you some perspective, I will use an example of some of Norwest Bank's fire operations ranking of their priorities. These thinking may be helpful to you. Of top priority to the bank was processing customers' deposits and checks. Second, they had to keep processing pension payments and customer payrolls. They had to establish money transfer capabilities because customers move large sums of money daily. And the next priorities were any service where the customer did not have another alternative. Now, whereas the following were of lesser importance due to time horizons, collateral, and existence of other alternatives for their customer base. For example, new business or personal loans were a lower priority. Obviously, a competitor is never a good solution, but what choice do you have? Home mortgages and installment loans were low on the priority list because they were collateralized and usually payments flowed on a monthly basis, so you could take your time recovering those applications. Reopening safe deposit boxes was a very low priority, but those customers were the most vocal in wanting to gain access because you did not know what was in that. Okay, the next section is identifying what vendors you will need for recovery. If you had to replicate your office operation, what are the bare necessities that would be needed? You could just rely on Google searches or be prepared with a list of preferred vendors in a crisis. Most companies will establish an ongoing relationship with many vendors. For example, if you use the same printer to provide forms, they probably have a master of your last order on file, so they can reproduce forms quickly for you. Or you may use a specific computer support company for company repairs, setup of local area networks, and even scheduled maintenance. They will have the schematics, hardware list, and software in stock to help you get up and running fast. You may want to talk to some of these vendors during your planning process to get their input. The next session of the recovery form deals with information processing, your data and computer operations. This drawing is merely a way to suggest how to look at your needs and your IT installation. This schematic is a typical way to depict the elements of a small company with a LAN or remote electronic access to data. Normally, your main server will be in the same location as your primary office. You may have a local area network in your office for multiple PCs to link to common data. But do you also have an outside sales force, a warehouse, or a branch office that also needs electronic access to your data? Even in a normal operation, you should have off-site backup of your data. This could be a cloud backup on the internet, a branch office, a file in an employee's office, and so forth. Now, let's look at the form. There may not be space on the form to adequately cover this resource in your plan. If not, use the appendix to supplement your statements in this section. We encourage you strongly to draft a schematic similar to the one on the prior slide and make it a part of your appendices. The 4 questions on the form will probably have more to determine your recovery than any other part of the questionnaire. All companies today use computers in some way. The first question is, what are you doing to protect your computer hardware? Do you regularly conduct maintenance and test the connections of all of the components? Do you have an uninterrupted power supply? The second question is more complex. It has 2 parts. What are you doing to protect your company's operating system software? Do you regularly update the drivers to your components? Do you automatically upgrade the operating system with any new versions, fixes, or features? Do you have a record of your usage licenses and passwords? Part of the second question deals with the software that you use, and the questions would apply. The same questions would apply. The third question is, what are your plans for a backup facility if your hardware is destroyed? Will you purchase current models of the same hardware as replacements? Will you use a contracted backup facility? Do you have a second site with a mirror set of hardware installed? The fourth question deals with electronic access. What are your plans to replace electronic access to your data? This can be a local area network in the same physical office space or remote access from employees' homes, Salesforce laptops, and so forth. Be sure you record your telecom vendor under key vendors. This section does not deal with your data files. They are considered a vital record and will be covered in a later section. Computer recovery is no good without the data to resume operations at any point of the crisis. We live in a world of instant communication. I don't list in the graphic image all of the tools available, such as social media, TV, newspapers, radio, and so forth. One member of the crisis management team should have the responsibility for communicating to your various audiences. This section of the template addresses employees. Add an addendum for using these tools for reaching key customers, regulatory agencies, the press, and the general public. Your image is at stake as well as your business recovery. Vital records. This is a key part of your plan. Every company has records to retain. Too often, it is a paper or a DVD copy stored within the office where it was originated. Most disasters, fires, flood, wind, will destroy these, so a more formal off-site backup program is needed. Your computer backups are one of the key vital records to list here. As you write this part of your plan, walk around your office and identify record storages and what is in the various files. Could you survive without them? Many of the files are nice to have, but are they crucial? Does another source exist, like a recording at the courthouse, a regulatory agency, or at a vendor's facility? Today, most records are created and updated on a computer. Digital copies are the easiest to back up, but other key documents can be converted to digital form by scanning them. Once in the computer, you can transmit them off-site or copy them to backup media, disk, hard drives, cloud storage. Don't overdo this list by including nice to have, but not crucial to survival. Common sense and fire marshals around the country have ingrained in us a need for plans for self-preservation. This is true for home or business. So whatever your evacuation plan is, it should be incorporated in this plan. Don't forget that sometimes security of the vacated premises is important, so vandals do not become a new issue. Public services, police, and fire will temporarily secure the site, but you should be prepared to assume this responsibility after the immediate crisis has passed. If a disaster plan is important enough to create, then it is absolutely necessary that it be tested in some manner. The test does not need to involve closing down your office, but pieces of this plan can be tested by themselves. The minimum test would be to have the crisis management team review this document, sitting together and discussing each section. That will confirm their roles, invite their input for changes, and stress that this plan is a normal part of your corporate processes. As a group, you may want to discuss a simulated event to see how each would respond. Other tests involve physically doing something. With sampling techniques, you can verify that the steps are functional on a small scale and should work in the case of a major disaster. The last two sections of the form are shown above. One is appendices. These are supplements to the textual form that we provide. Use them to supplement the text if there's not enough space to explain your intent. A good example would be the IT computer processing section. This can involve a lot of detail. We have not talked about specific customers, so you may want a list of those and plans to meet their specific needs. Other examples might be human resource stress programs, regulatory guidelines, maps, and so forth. The annual review should be signed off by the CEO to emphasize the importance to the company. You're done. You filled the form in. The template with its appendices will become your documented plan. Hopefully, you have made adaptations to reflect your unique situation or business. Then distribute the plan as shown on the slides. Now we enter a new phase.
Alarm at 6 and Nicollet, box 110 Bravo. Engines 2 and ladder 3 respond to the fire. A 5-5 alarm, 6th and Nicollet, box 110 Bravo. Engine 2 and ladder 3 respond to the fire. KZV 213, 1736.
There you heard a disaster unfolding. Fire truck sirens. They are always scary, but they're more so when your business is the target. Northwest Bank's fire, as I told you, was a setting, and this is a scene of downtown Minneapolis on November 25th, 1982. They lost 470,000 square feet of usable space. The fire displaced 1,500 employees, and the recovery period took 6 years to build a new building on that site. Remember, this could happen to you. The bank never assumed the entire building could be lost, but it was. The recovery plan, the control center, and employee ingenuity filled in the gaps. The plan gave them a starting point, allowed them to catch their breath, and then adapt to the situation. It worked for them, and it can work for you. So a disaster strikes. Now what? This is the agenda for the second part of this webinar. We will illustrate how a plan might be used to recover from a disaster. If you have done your planning well, this is just an execution of its provisions. Our agenda is shown on the slide before you. Start any recovery by grabbing your disaster recovery plan. There will be confusion. Recognize that this is normal. Now your plan becomes your crutch, a roadmap, a tool to react with your experience and ingenuity, and finally, a checklist. Remember, a disaster recovery plan is not a procedure manual on how individuals perform their daily tasks. It is assumed your staff is cross-trained and can perform their duties with the proper tools. If you do have such detailed job procedures, then file them with the plan and use them as needed in case some key staff member is on vacation or otherwise not available. Disaster recovery takes a specific sequence and rolls out in a specific manner. It is expensive and disruptive to initiate a full disaster recovery operations. Hence, once the initial reactive steps are taken, deliberately step back, assess how serious the situation is, and then, and only then, activate the plan. You may decide to wait 24 hours or until you can assess the condition of your primary site, or you may use a weekend to counsel with the crisis management team and possibly declare only a partial disaster. Remember, in this case, haste makes waste. Once you declare a disaster, recovery starts taking place on all fronts simultaneously. The crisis management team acts like a conductor, reading the facts and directing the use of resources. So the first 5 steps on this slide are taken sequentially. And from that point on, when the disaster is cleared, everything happens simultaneously. So keep that in mind. This continues the discussion on the recovery operations. Once you have caught your breath, you will be operating in a recovery mode. Your staff will be mobilizing. Space will be rented. Replacement resources may be acquired. And customer service will be at a limited level for which you have planned. Community and customer communications are crucial. Being open is recommended. So you operate in a recovery mode and then gradually restore your full operations. As time elapses, additional resources, customer services can be added as you resume normal operations. This can be at your repaired original site or a new permanent site. It took Norwest Bank 3 months to get back to what they could call, quote, normal operations. Even though they were in 10 new locations, 1,500 employees were dealing with new equipment and new environments. Restoration. Once you are operating, restoration starts immediately after a disaster has been declared. The first task is to secure the facilities at the original site and salvage what can be used by the business in recovery efforts. The second task is to acquire temporary or substitute quarters for displaced operations. It will be difficult to rent space for short periods of time, so an estimate of the outage and the remodeling or rebuilding time frame is important. Normally, facilities on this diagram would be managed by your property manager and not include vital records. For disaster recovery, it works best to combine the two on one team. Restoration can go on for months or years if you have to remodel or rebuild. Vital records restoration is another time-consuming process. The restoration vendors that salvage burnt, charred, or wet documents are very specialized. This is a simple summary of the process that they might follow. Dry records are placed in boxes in the same order as they are found. Charred or smoke-damaged records handle as little as possible. Place them in boxes and move to deodorize them on an off-premise site. They can be then reproduced by scanning or photocopying. Wet records are a big problem. Wrap records in bundles about 3 inches thick, seal with tape, and freeze them to stop the mold that will develop. Use a refrigerated truck if necessary. Then after drying, they can be scanned or photocopied. Use whatever preventive steps you can by using fire-resistant file cabinets, off-site storage, or duplication. There are specialized record restoration businesses in most communities to help with this task. You may want to identify them now. Recovering from a disaster always involves some kind of insurance. Risk management for a company plays a role before and after a disaster. There are several levels of risk. There are 1, assumed risk. They are represented by deductibles and policy limits. There are insured risk, coverage from the normal insurance program. And then there are disaster risk too large to assume and impractical to insure. The accounting department should create a new entity within the accounts structure of your company to record all costs related to the recovery. There are guidelines that the Accounting Standards Board has established for extraordinary expenses and contingencies. Check with your accountant for these guidelines. Some of the insurable risks relate to a disaster as listed above. Extra expense is an excess cost over and above what is normal operation. Business interruption insurance is a monetary loss resulting from a total or partial suspension of business. Valuable records is usually written. It covers written or printed documents, but excludes money, securities, and electronic data. Errors and omission insurance is to cover mistakes from operating at alternative sites or defects in backup data. Directors and officers' liability insurance covers negligence on their part in not taking proper preventive steps like a disaster recovery plan. As I mentioned earlier, we have additional resources that you may want to pursue. This is a list of 3 of them. Remember to print out the template as your model to follow. If you feel your planning needs are more complex than this questionnaire can handle, then we suggest that you go to the site biztools.biz/disaster recovery. There you will find backup articles on disaster recovery and planning, images that you can use internally for training, and forms that are more complex than what we incorporated into the template. You're welcome to use any of that material to supplement your plan or adapt it to your needs. Then the SBA has under their Learning Center a number of videos and documents and links for disaster recovery planning. And finally, ready.gov is a good location for training material. So check out all 3 of those to see if you need any of help that they offer. No webinar, particularly this one, can answer all of your how-to questions. Therefore, consider using other SCORE facilities to help. We strongly encourage you to seek counseling at your local SCORE Minnesota chapter. They offer many services that you will find on their individual websites. They know the local business community and can provide their insight and other experience to you. If you are from outside of Minnesota, we urge you to establish a relationship with your local SCORE chapter in other parts of the country. Simply enter your zip code on the score.org website and you will find that there is a SCORE chapter near you. Finally, if you have other questions, we have an email dedicated to serving you. We ask that you be as specific as possible so we can research your issue or direct you to another source. As a non-profit organization dedicated to helping you start or grow a business, we must make these disclosures. We rely on various experts to present a topic, and the content is strictly for your education. SCORE Minnesota, nor any of its chapters endorse any specific vendor. And finally, Any screenshots of websites and so forth are provided only for illustration and not a statement of fact. Well, that concludes our webinar, but in closing, we want to recognize the organizations that make these webinars possible. First, we are grateful to various SCORE members for sharing their experience. In this case, it is myself, a 17-year counselor with SCORE Minneapolis. Second, we recognize Veritas Marketing for guiding us through the technical and policy issues of producing these webinars. Third, Wells Fargo, whose funding and support makes this service possible. As you know, Wells Fargo is the successor to Norwest Bank Minneapolis that is cited in this presentation. We hope we have answered some of your concerns about planning for an emergency. Goodbye and good luck.